My neighbor Karen thought she ruled our quiet little street with her entitled attitude. When her house key suddenly failed and she dialed 911 in a panic screaming for help, she had no clue that the calm professional voice answering her call belonged to my son Paul. Boy, was she in for the shock of her life. I let out a long sigh just thinking about it, folks. You know those neighbors who turn every little thing into a war. Karen moved into the other side of our duplex 3 years ago, and from day one she made it her mission to make our lives miserable. The scent of her strong perfume would drift over the fence every morning mixed with the fresh cut grass from my yard, but it always carried this heavy tension like a storm cloud that never left. Paul, my 28-year-old son, lived with me back then, helping with the property while he trained to become a 911 dispatcher. He is the kindest guy you will ever meet, always patient, always there when someone really needs help. But Karen, oh man, she saw us as the enemy right from the start. First it was the noise complaints. Can you imagine? My kids' grandkids would come over for a simple backyard barbecue and suddenly sirens are blaring because Karen called the cops saying we were disturbing the peace. I remember standing on the porch one summer evening, the smell of grilled burgers still hanging in the warm air when the officer pulled up. What kind of person does that to a family just trying to enjoy life? I shook my head that day and muttered under my breath, this is getting ridiculous. Paul was home from his training shift and he just put a hand on my shoulder and said, Mom, we will handle it the right way. But Karen kept pushing. She filed reports claiming Paul was harassing her when all he did was mow the lawn a little early on Saturdays. The frustration built up in my chest like a knot that would not loosen. I would lie awake at night hearing her slam her door across the shared wall, the sharp bang echoing through the quiet house, making my heart race every time. Then came the parking wars. She blocked my driveway twice, claiming it was her space even though the lease clearly said otherwise. I tried talking to her calmly one afternoon, the sun beating down on us as I stood there sweating. Look, Karen, we can figure this out like adults. But she just crossed her arms and sneered. I pay rent here and you are nothing but a slumlord. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the peaceful afternoon birdsong like a knife. I took a deep breath, the scent of her cigarette smoke stinging my nose, and walked away before I said something I would regret. Paul heard the whole thing from inside, and later that night over coffee, he told me, Mom, I have been studying emergency calls and people like her waste resources that could save real lives. Little did we know how right he was. The false reports kept coming. Animal control twice because she claimed my old dog barked too much. The dog who barely left the porch and spent his days napping in the sun. Each time the officer would knock, the knock echoing like a warning, and I would explain with a tired sigh, showing proof that everything was fine. The stress started showing on all of us. Paul would come home from training shifts rubbing his temples, saying, I just want to help people who truly need it, not deal with this nonsense. I would pat his back and say, we are strong, we will get through it. But inside I felt the anger bubbling, wondering how one woman could cause so much chaos. The neighborhood even started whispering about her. The couple across the street would wave and shake their heads when they saw her car pull in. Can you believe the drama she brings every single week? By the second year things got worse. Karen stopped paying rent on time, always with some excuse about repairs that never existed. I worked hard to keep the duplex nice, painting the trim myself, the smell of fresh paint filling the air on weekends while Paul helped carry ladders. She would complain about everything: the water pressure, the mailbox, the shared fence. One day she even called the city, claiming we were running an illegal business out of the garage. I stood there in the driveway that afternoon, the sun warm on my back, listening to the inspector explain the complaint, and I just sighed deeply, feeling the weight of it all. Paul pulled me aside later and said, Mom, we have the paperwork, she is violating the lease. We started the legal process quietly because I did not want more drama. But Karen smelled trouble and ramped up her attacks. She left nasty notes on my door, the paper fluttering in the breeze with words that made my blood boil. I would read them and crumple the paper, the crunch sounding loud in the quiet morning. Then came the day everything changed. It was a bright sunny afternoon, the kind where the sky is endless blue and the air smells sweet from blooming flowers. I had just finished the eviction paperwork with my lawyer, the official letter sitting on my kitchen table like a quiet victory. Paul was at the dispatch center starting his shift, his voice steady and professional over the phone when we talked earlier. I felt a sense of relief for the first time in years. But then I heard the pounding from next door. Karen had come home and her key would not turn. She had tried forcing it earlier that week, probably trying to break something out of spite, and now the lock was jammed solid. The metallic scrape of metal on metal echoed across the yard as she twisted and cursed. I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my feet, and watched her from a safe distance. "What is going on, Karen?" She spun around, her face twisted in rage, the sun catching the sweat on her forehead. "My key failed because you sabotaged it, you witch. I am calling 911 right now, this is an emergency." I crossed my arms, the frustration rising, but I stayed calm. "Karen, it is not an emergency, just call a locksmith." But she was already dialing her phone, the shrill beep of the numbers cutting through the peaceful afternoon. I could hear her voice rising as the call connected. "Hello, yes, this is an emergency. My landlord locked me out and I cannot get into my home. Send police now." Paul told me later he recognized the address the second it popped up on his screen. His heart skipped, but he stayed professional the way only he can. "Ma'am, this is 911. What is your emergency?" Her voice exploded through the headset, the shrill tone making him wince even though he was trained for it. "My key broke in the lock and I am trapped outside. You need to send someone immediately to break down the door. I pay taxes for this." Paul took a slow breath, the hum of the dispatch room fading as he focused. "Ma'am, a broken key is not an emergency. I can advise you on a locksmith or non-emergency services." But Karen cut him off, her words tumbling out fast and angry. "Do not tell me what is an emergency, you idiot. I demand police right now or I will report you." The scent of her anger almost seemed to travel through the phone, the way her voice cracked with pure entitlement. I stood there on my porch, the warm breeze carrying the sound of her rant across the yard. I could hear every word because she was yelling so loud. My hands tightened on the railing, the wood rough under my palms as I listened. Paul kept his cool on the other end. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and confirm your address." She spat it out and he paused just for a second. The same address he had heard a dozen times from her false reports. He knew it was her. The woman who had called about my family over and over, wasting precious time. But he stayed professional. "I am dispatching a unit for a welfare check, but please stop yelling, it is not helping." Karen screamed louder. "You are useless, just like that slumlord next door. I bet she put you up to this." I let out a deep sigh, feeling the mix of relief and tension swirl in my stomach like a storm brewing. The neighbor across the way cracked his window, the creak loud in the quiet street, and peeked out, eyes wide. "Can you believe this?" the guy whispered to himself, but I heard it. The sun beat down hot on my shoulders as Karen paced back and forth, the gravel crunching under her shoes. She kept yelling into the phone, demanding action, threatening lawsuits. Paul on his end was typing notes, flagging the call for review because he recognized the pattern. He told me later his hands were steady, but inside he was thinking, "This ends today, Mom." I watched her face turn redder, the veins popping as she screamed. "What kind of person calls emergency services for a key, folks?" I shook my head, the frustration from years of her nonsense rising up, making my chest tight. Minutes dragged on, the distant sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing louder. Karen heard them too and smirked at me. "See, they are coming for you now." But when the patrol car pulled up, the officer did not rush to her side. He stepped out slowly, notepad in hand, the door thudding shut with finality. "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible lockout, but dispatch has flagged this as non-emergency." Karen spun on him. "What do you mean non-emergency? I am locked out." The officer glanced at me, then back at her. "We have records of multiple prior calls from this address, all unfounded." Her mouth fell open, the shock hitting her like a slap. I could see the panic start to creep in the way her hands shook as she gripped the useless phone. Paul stayed on the line the whole time, listening professionally, but he had already noted the abuse. The officer asked for her ID and she handed it over reluctantly, the paper crinkling in the breeze. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled with more info from dispatch. Paul had sent over the history quietly. The officer sighed heavily. Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us for a statement about misuse of emergency services. Karen exploded again, her voice echoing off the duplex walls. This is outrageous. I pay your salary. The neighbor watched, mouth open in disbelief, the afternoon air thick with the scent of hot asphalt and rising drama. I stepped closer, my heart pounding but my voice steady. Karen, this has gone on long enough. She glared at me, pure hatred in her eyes, but the officer stepped between us. Ma'am, please. The tension hung heavy like a cloud ready to burst. Paul later told me he could hear the whole thing through the open line, and he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing justice was finally moving. But Karen was not done fighting. She lunged toward the officer, yelling accusations, the shrill sound piercing the bright afternoon like a siren itself. The officer grabbed her arm gently but firm, the click of the handcuffs sounding sharp and final in the quiet street. Karen screamed louder, her face contorted in rage. You cannot do this to me. I demand to speak to your supervisor. The neighbor had come out fully now, standing on his lawn, the grass rustling under his feet as he watched the scene unfold. I let out a long breath, the weight of 3 years lifting just a little with every word she sputtered. The smell of her perfume mixed with sweat hung thick in the air as the officer read her rights, calm and professional. Ma'am, you are being detained for misuse of 911, and we have records of over a dozen false reports from your number. Her eyes went wide, the realization hitting her hard. Paul was still on the line, listening to every detail. He had flagged the call early, and when the officer radioed for backup, Paul confirmed the history himself. The dispatcher voice was steady, but I know my son. He felt the justice in it. Karen twisted, trying to pull away, the metal cuffs clinking as the second officer arrived. What records? This is a setup by that woman next door. The first officer shook his head. No ma'am, the records are clear. Calls about noise that was just kids playing. Calls about harassment when no one was there. Even a call claiming a break-in last month that turned out to be your own delivery driver. Karen went pale, her knees buckling slightly as the truth sank in. The bright sun cast long shadows across the driveway, making the whole moment feel surreal. I stood there, arms still crossed, the wooden porch railing warm under my hands. Years of her bullying flashed through my mind, the sleepless nights, the angry notes, the way she made Paul doubt himself. The officer turned to me. Ma'am, we will need a statement, but it looks like the eviction was already in process. I nodded, feeling the relief wash over me like cool water. Yes, officer, here are the papers. Karen overheard and lunged again, but the cuffs held her. You changed the locks. This is illegal. I sighed deeply, looking her straight in the eye. No, Karen, you violated the lease for months. The court agreed. The scent of fresh flowers from my garden suddenly seemed sweeter, as if the neighborhood itself was breathing easier. The neighbor shook his head, muttering loud enough for us all to hear. About time someone stood up to her. Karen glared at him too, but the fight was draining from her voice. The officers led her toward the patrol car, the gravel crunching under their boots. She kept yelling, but her words lost power, the shrill tone cracking with panic. I want my lawyer. This will ruin you all. But the radio crackled again with more details Paul had sent over. The department had been tracking her pattern for months after one of her calls wasted resources during a real emergency across town. Paul told me later his shift supervisor patted him on the back. Good catch, son. The tension in the air peaked as they placed her in the back seat, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud. I watched the car pull away, the sirens off this time, just a quiet departure. My heart raced, but in a good way, the kind of racing that comes after winning a long, hard fight. The neighbor walked over, patting my shoulder. You okay, Sarah? I smiled for the first time in ages. Better than okay. The warm sun felt like a hug, the birds starting to sing again as if celebrating. But the biggest twist was still coming. Karen demanded to know who took her call, and when they told her it was Paul the dispatcher, she went silent in the back seat, the color draining from her face completely. She had spent years harassing my family, and now the one person she screamed at on the phone was the son she had tried to destroy. Karma, folks, it does not miss. The officers took statements right there on the driveway, the notepad pages flipping in the breeze. I recounted everything, the false reports, the threats, the unpaid rent. Each word lifted another layer of weight off my shoulders. The officer nodded seriously. "We will be recommending charges, ma'am. Misuse of emergency services carries fines and possible jail time, especially with the pattern." I took a deep breath, the air tasting clean for the first time in years. "Thank you." Paul called me right after his shift, the pride in his voice making tears sting my eyes. "Mom," I stayed professional, but knowing it was her, it felt right. I laughed softly into the phone, the sound light and free. "You did good, son. You really did." The weeks that followed brought the full storm of justice, and it was sweeter than I could have imagined. Karen sat in court, the wooden benches creaking as people filled the room, the air thick with the scent of old paper and quiet anticipation. I sat in the back row, my hands folded in my lap, heart steady for the first time in years. Paul was there too, off duty in a simple shirt, looking calm and strong. The judge played the recorded 911 call, the shrill voice of Karen echoing through the courtroom, demanding police for a broken key. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Can you believe the entitlement, folks?" The prosecutor laid out the evidence, call after call, all false, all wasting time that could have saved lives. Karen sat there, head down, her fancy clothes wrinkled, the fight gone from her eyes. She tried one last rant when the judge asked for her side. "This is all a setup by my landlord and her son." But the evidence was ironclad. Paul had documented everything professionally, and the department records sealed it. The judge sighed heavily, banging the gavel. "Miss, you are fined $10,000 and ordered to pay restitution. Further, you are banned from contacting the family or the property. Community service for emergency services, education." Karen broke down right there, sobbing loudly, the sound raw and broken. The same woman who had terrorized us now faced the consequences in front of everyone. The bitter end she never saw coming. Officers escorted her out, the handcuffs clicking again as the courtroom emptied. She glared at me one last time, but it held no power, just defeat. We sold the duplex a month later, the new owners, a nice young family who waved hello every morning. The scent of fresh paint filled the air as we packed up, and Paul helped carry boxes, his laugh ringing out free and easy. I stood in the empty yard one last time, the sun warm on my face, and breathed deep. The frustration, the anger, all of it washed away like rain after a drought. Paul put his arm around me. "Mom, we stood up to the bully, and look what happened." I smiled, tears in my eyes. "Yes, we did, son. And you were the one on the line that day, making sure justice came full circle." The whole neighborhood changed after that. People talked less in whispers and more with smiles. The couple across the street brought over cookies one evening, the sweet smell drifting through the open window as we sat on the porch sharing stories. No more slamming doors, no more false sirens. Just peace. I often think about that bright afternoon when Karen dialed 911, not knowing Paul was already there listening. It was not about revenge, it was about respect. Respect for the people who answer the hard calls every single day. Respect for families who just want to live without fear. Karma has a way of stepping in when we least expect it, but when we need it most. If you are dealing with your own Karen right now, hold on. Stay calm, document everything, and trust that the truth wins. My son Paul still works dispatch, saving real lives every shift, and I could not be prouder. We stood together, we spoke up, and justice was served. That is the power of doing the right thing, folks. Never forget it. The world needs more people like my Paul and less like Karen. And when the key fails and the call goes out, remember, sometimes the person on the other end knows exactly who you are. Take care out there, and remember, karma is always listening.